So hello everyone again. My name is Sean and I'm the chair for today's symposium. And today we're going to talk about the cross-cultural research in analogical reasoning. And we have three wonderful speakers and a discussant to join us today. And the speakers are Dr. Daniel Casasanto from the Cornell Universities, Stella Christie from the Tsinghua University, and Lindsey Richland from the University of California, Irvine. And our discussant for our panel discussion will be Dr. Caren Walker from the University of California, San Diego. So for today's talk, we will first hear the presentations from each of our presenters. Each will be around 20 minutes. And for the audience, if you have any questions, we would like you to save them until after the panel discussion. Following the presentations, we'll have Dr. Caren Walker to lead the panel discussion with the speakers. This will take another 15 to 30 minutes. And lastly, we'll open the floor to the audience Q&A for the speakers and discussions. And we expect this to be another 30 minutes. So again, here's some rules for the symposium and the audience Q&A. So we would like you to make sure your microphone are turned off during presentations, although feel free to have your camera on if you'd like to. And for clarification questions during presentations, please enter them in the chat box and either someone from the group will ask or the discussant and the chair will ask the speakers. For questions and comments as audience Q&A, please either enter them in the chat box or use the raise hand features to ask them yourself. If you have a follow-up comment or questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in before we move on to the next questions. And lastly, please note this symposium is being recorded. And added versions without Q&A will be made public, and a recording with the full seminar will be sent to the analogy list group for those who are unable to attend the sessions. All right, so to begin, the topic is going to be about culture and analogical reasoning. Culture is often described as influencing the functions and development of cognitive process. However, the nature and the extent of cultural influence on cognitions remains largely an open question. In this symposium, we will explore this question through the lens of analogical reasoning, a cognitive capacity laying at the heart of higher level processes, such as abstract reasoning, language, and the constructions of conceptual knowledge. We will re-examine the long-standing questions, such as do East Asians and Westerners differ in their analogical abilities, and if so, how does the differences arise? So again, for today's symposium, we have the honor to have the three wonderful presenters, Daniel Casasanto, Stella Christie, and Lindsey Richland, and Caren Walker, to present and discuss recent evidence on cross-cultural commonalities and divergence in people's relational tendencies and analogical reasoning. For our first presentations, Dr. Daniel Casasanto will talk about abstract thinking across culture on actions and analogies. Daniel Casasanto is the Associate Professor of Human Development and Psychology at Cornell University and the Director of the Experience and Cognition Lab. He studies how the diversity of human experience is reflected in our brains and minds, how people with different physical and social experience come to think, feel, and act differently in fundamental ways. To study cognitive diversity across cultures, Dr. Casasanto's lab has conducted research across 5 continents using methods that range from watching children play to brain imagings and neural stimulations. Please take the floor, Daniel.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. Let me negotiate with Zoom here for a moment. Okay. Can you see my slides? Good. And I can see you. Can you also see me? So I know whether my wild gesticulations are doing any good. I guess I still don't know, but I'll gesture anyway. So Good evening or good morning, and thanks to the organizers for bringing us all together. I'd like to talk about some work in my lab that's being led by a grad student, Amrit Singh. I believe that Amrit's here in the audience. I certainly hope so in case we get hard questions. And this is a project that's exploring what it means to think abstractly and asking whether some cultures are more inclined toward abstract thinking than others. So one cross-cultural difference discussed in hundreds of papers is this difference in mindset between Westerners, meaning typically North Americans or Western Europeans, and East Asians, usually Chinese, Japanese, or South Korean people. And in this literature, as I'm sure you know, Westerners are typically characterized as individualistic and East Asians as collectivistic. What does this mean? Well, Westerners tend to think of themselves as more independent and are more focused on the self, whereas East Asians are more interdependent, focused on their relationships with other people. And these tendencies, these personal tendencies, co-vary with more analytic or holistic styles of perception. Arguably, what ties together these bundles, these different cognitive profiles, is either a greater or a lesser sensitivity to the physical and social context. So having a holistic or an analytic perceptual style, which is sometimes metaphorized as seeing the forest or just seeing the trees, means being more or less sensitive to the physical context in which objects are embedded. Having an independent or interdependent interpersonal style means being more or less sensitive to your social context. So the question that we're going to ask is, what are the cognitive consequences of these different levels of attention to the physical and social context? Well, the answer to that question depends who you ask. Perhaps surprisingly, there are cultural psychologists who have argued that attention to the context traps you in a concrete world of the visible and the tangible. In a landmark paper, Richard Nisbet and colleagues suggested that East Asians should be more concrete in their conceptualizations and should have a greater concern with concrete objects and events than Westerners. By contrast, Westerners should be more capable than East Asians of reasoning based on logical rules. Now, to our knowledge, there's only one paper that tested this suggestion directly. Norenzayan et al. In 2002 compared East Asians and Westerners' formal reasoning abilities. And they found that Westerners were better at certain kinds of syllogisms, a classic form of logical inference. But the only studies that we know of that have tried to replicate this finding have failed. So we're for the moment, we're treating these findings as a maybe. It's notable, however, that these suggestions in these important papers from the 21st century in cultural psychology echo claims from Western scholars over the past century about Westerners and non-Westerners' tendencies toward abstract thought. In particular, Chinese people have really gotten the brunt of this. We have claims like Chinese people have no taste for abstract symbols, the Chinese language is an unsuitable vehicle for abstract ideas, and traditional Chinese thinking was indifferent to abstraction. Now, this sounds like it must just be crazy and racist and unprincipled, but let's ask for a moment, why might Western scholars have believed things like this? Well, granting the possibility that there are some reasons other than prejudice or exoticization, one suggestion has been that writing systems might be either a cause or a consequence of differing levels of abstract thought. So compared to Western alphabets, logographic characters are concrete by virtue of their iconicity. It's also possible to find differences in the complexity of morphology or syntax between East Asian and European languages. And in the cultural psych literature, scholars have suggested that modern psychological differences might be traced to the ancient philosophy of the East and the West. Only in the West were methods developed for formal logic and computation. So this latter point, this formal logic, has been the focus of the only experimental work that is addressing this question directly of which cultures think more abstractly. But if we think about it, formal logic is only one instance of abstract thinking. Other ways that people can think more or less abstractly include, for example, thinking about wholes instead of parts, thinking about relationships or about the objects that are being related, thinking about actions goals instead of the details of an action's implementation, and you knew I'd get there, thinking analogically. So as a paradigm case of abstract thought. If we look at these first two, these have been tested. How people think about wholes versus parts and how people think about relations versus the things being related have been tested across lots of studies. And we have lots of previous data that bear on whether East Asians or Westerners are more likely to think abstractly in these ways, in these perceptual ways. The last two on this list concern higher cognition, and these have been the subject of the work that I'll discuss from my lab. Overall, what I'm going to argue is that rather than being an impediment to abstract thinking, sensitivity to the physical and context can be an engine of abstract thought. Turning to this first idea, thinking about wholes instead of parts that compose the wholes, thinking globally, that is, instead of locally. This is one of the most intuitive notions of what it means to think abstractly. That's what we mean when we use expressions like seeing the forest instead of the trees, right? Well, in fact, seeing the forest or the trees is almost exactly the title of a classic paper concerning global versus local visual perception. When people are given stimuli like this, people of all cultures tend to attend more quickly to the global gestalt, the big letter, rather than to the little letters that make up the big letter. This is a task by Yinyuan from the 1970s. When this tendency to see the forest before the trees, to see the abstract gestalt first, is stronger in East Asians than it is in Westerners. Now, this task was not intended as a test of abstract versus concrete thinking, but it's straightforward to reinterpret it that way. And when we do, it's the Asians who are attending to the more abstract level of perceptual organization. Turning to a second notion of abstractness, thinking about relationships or about the objects being related, the same is true. In a now classic study known as the Michigan fish task, at cultural psychology conferences, everyone is required to put this picture on their slide somewhere, so I'm just doing my job. This task shows how attention to objects versus relations differs across cultures. When asked to describe this underwater scene, Westerners were more likely to mention objects, saying things like, oh, there was a frog. Whereas East Asians were more likely to report relationships between those objects, noting that the frog doesn't just exist, that the frog is embedded in this scene and it's swimming out of some seaweed, etc. So let's sort of tally up where things stand. So far, we've mentioned these 5 different notions of what it means to think abstractly. And the first one we're going to consider still, so the jury is still out. But the next one, we've got pretty good evidence across a bunch of studies that East Asians are more likely than Westerners to see the forest before the trees, to think about wholes instead of parts, and more likely than Westerners to attend to relations between objects and not just to the individuated objects themselves. For these final two, my students and I have turned to some widely used tests of abstract thinking. The first is a test of how people think about actions. So this is lifted from the social psychology literature from the 1980s. Valashay and Wegner bequeathed us this questionnaire that's been used hundreds of times to probe how people think about actions. The questionnaire is called the Behavioral Identification Form. I'll abbreviate it as the BIF. So it's predicated on the idea that actions are structured hierarchically. The same action can be conceptualized at different levels of abstraction. So take an action like voting. You can think about voting multiple different ways. In its most concrete form, voting means performing a motor action, marking a ballot, making a check in a box, or pulling a lever, right? At a much more abstract level, voting means trying to influence an election. Now, which of these is the right way to think about voting? Well, there is no right way, but people can tend to construe this action, voting and lots of other actions, at either a concrete or an abstract level more naturally. So that's what the BIF, the Behavioral Identification Form, asks. There are 25 items like voting where people see this questionnaire and they see that the action named, and then they get two options, an abstract construal and a concrete construal, and they choose which one seems like the best description of the action to them. So we've used this to compare head-to-head East Asians and Westerners to address the question, do East Asians or Westerners and Westerners differ in how abstractly they tend to think about actions, whether they tend to adopt this high-level action construal or a more concrete low-level construal. So what should we predict? Well, if we take a page from the cross-cultural psychology literature and posit that attention to the context mires you in the details, right? Traps you in the concrete, then Westerners should tend to construe these actions more concretely than East Asians. Alternatively, if it's the case that context helps you to see the big picture, then the East Asians should be construing these same actions more concretely. How can we find out? Well, we just need to look at how many of these BIF questionnaire items people construe abstractly or concretely across cultures. So here's what the data look like. On the x-axis, this is how many out of 25 items individuals have construed abstractly on average. More farther to the right is more abstract construals, farther to the left is more concrete construals. And this is just a box plot. The diamond is the mean. And this up here is a half violin. It's like a smooth histogram. So you can see there's a big hump in the middle. It's a little bit bimodal, but in general, US participants are somewhere in the middle here, about 15 items on average that they are construing abstractly. If we compare that to the Chinese, we see that there is a highly significant difference. The Chinese, and you can see that the distribution of responses is really skewed differently in the Chinese, skewed way toward the abstract end of things. That compared to the US participants, this large national sample of Chinese participants show a much stronger tendency to construe the same actions more abstractly. So for brevity, I'm just giving you one big graph about all of these studies, but actually Amrit ran this study 3 times in 3 independent pairs of large national online samples of Chinese people and US participants. And we get the same result every time, which is why we just aggregate them for simplicity. And this relationship holds, this cross-cultural difference holds, even when we control for demographic factors that could plausibly affect how abstractly people construe things like age and sex and education level do not interact with the difference of interest. So one limitation of this kind of cross-cultural study, that there's a virtue of doing national online samples in people's home country in their native languages, which is validity, external validity. A limitation is that you are varying lots of things, right? You're varying in addition to this abstract notion of culture, you're varying the genetics of the population, the location of the population, the economics, and perhaps consequentially, the language that they're speaking. The Chinese people did the BIF in a careful translation that our Mandarin collaborators did. Are we sure that what we're seeing here has something to do with culture as opposed to language? Well, one of the ways that we've gone about making sure that we're seeing cultural differences and not linguistic differences is to ask the same question within China, within subcultures of China, where everyone is speaking the same language, Mandarin Chinese, but they are members of different subcultures within the larger country. So how do we, what we want here are subcultures that are known to differ in this relevant characteristic of individualism versus collectivism. How would we find them? Well, fortunately, Thomas Talham and colleagues have identified provinces that are historically associated with wheat growing or rice growing. And Talham and others have shown that excuse me, this individualism versus collectivism distinction that we find across nations and across Eastern and Western cultures can be found within different provinces of China that historically grow rice or wheat. Why? Well, look at these pictures of what it takes to be a rice farmer versus a wheat farmer. You are shoulder to shoulder with others when you're farming rice, and you can be a lone ranger as a wheat farmer. And accordingly, within China, previous studies have shown more collectivistic tendencies in rice province members of rice provinces than in wheat provinces. So we knew where the participants in our Chinese sample were located when they performed the task. And Amrit was able to sort the data into rice versus wheat province and test whether the people from rice provinces who have been established previously to be more collectivistic were construing events more abstractly versus people from wheat provinces who have been established previously to be more individualistic were adopting more concrete construals. And that's just what we find. So rice provinces on top, more collectivistic, wheat provinces on bottom, more individualistic. Now, this is a highly significant difference, but it's more subtle. The difference in means is more subtle within China than between China and the US. Perhaps that's to be expected, just to convince ourselves that this is not only statistically reliable, but really robust. Amrit plotted this difference between rice versus wheat for each of the 25 items on the BIF. And as you can see here, 24 out of the 25 show this pattern where the people from rice provinces choose more abstract construals. So it looks like quite a robust tendency. So let's go back to our tally here. It looks like we can put another check in the column where East Asians are thinking more abstractly as indexed by the way that they construe actions in terms of their high-level goals instead of their concrete implementations. Let's turn to analogical reasoning. Now, should we expect East Asians to be better at analogical reasoning than Westerners, and if so, why? Well, what makes analogical reasoning abstract? Analogy requires discovering invisible, intangible relationships between objects or ideas that, of course, may appear dissimilar on the surface at the concrete level. Thinking about relationships means thinking about objects or ideas in the context of other objects or ideas. Compared to Westerners, East Asians exhibit more relational, that is, more context-dependent patterns of perceiving and of understanding the physical and social world. So if you're more inclined toward relational thinking and toward considering objects in context, maybe you should be better at analogy, right? That's the reasoning behind our testing this. How do we test analogy in a culture neutral way? So many tests of analogy are strongly dependent on language. Well, luckily, we have an almost century-old test that's been administered in thousands of samples, Raven's progressive matrices, that is entirely pictorial, right? It's just wonderful for very, very portable for taking across cultures. This is a standard, this is a sample item from the standard progressive matrix task. The participant's job is to figure out what the analogical relationships between the parts of the puzzles are. So you get this grid, this matrix, and you see these transformations horizontally and vertically, and your job is to choose one of these 8 puzzle pieces down here that fits into the series analogically. So it's fun to let people figure this out for themselves. I'm sure you could do it. Actually, in this group, you've probably seen the SPM many times. But the point here is that it's a nonverbal test of analogy. There are a bunch of different subscales within this task. We recruited participants in US and China in large national online samples. Once again, the instructions were given in the native language, but all of the problems are purely pictorial. We used only set E of this multi-set task for people who are familiar with the SPM. That's the last set of 12 trials. The reason is that this is more, oh, I'm out of time. This is the most clearly analogical. You can't just do a pattern completion to solve this question. Then we got some demographics. Here's the punchline. Chinese people in this national online sample were much better at this task of analogical reasoning than our Caucasian US participants, embarrassingly better, almost 50% higher scores. This is the number of correct responses out of 12. To make sure that we weren't fooling ourselves and to hope that the US Caucasians would catch up a little bit and the difference would be slightly less embarrassing, we ran it again in another large online national sample, found the same pattern, slightly less embarrassing. But we can confidently put a check in this last box on our chart. Indeed, these cross-cultural differences that we found previously generalized to analogical reasoning. To wrap up, people from collectivistic cultures and subcultures are more likely to think abstractly than people from individualistic cultures, as indexed both by tests of event construal and by this test of analogical reasoning. These results challenge a long-standard generalization that East Asians think less abstractly than Westerners, and support this idea that sensitivity to context does not trap people in a concrete world. On the contrary, attending to context is an engine of abstract thought. Thanks to the people who gave us their money, and thanks especially to the grad students who did all of this work. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Daniel, for the wonderful and intriguing presentations. I'm sure we all have questions, but before we speak it out loud, let's move on to our second presenter, Stella Christie, who will be talking about culture and relational thinking. So Stella Christie is an associate professor at Tsinghua University, research chair at the Tsinghua Brain and Intelligence Laboratory, and director of the Child Cognition Center. Her research focuses on understanding relational cognition in humans and other animals, investing in questions such as what are the basic relations that human and other animals possess, and how do we learn to become relational thinker, and what is the role of relational cognition in social mind. Having lived in 6 countries on all hemispheres, Dr. Christie has a particular interest in how relational reasoning is influenced by and influences language, culture, and social interactions. Stella, please take the floor.
All right. Thank you, Sean, for organizing this. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I know it's actually late for many of you. It's very late for Dedri. And I see Dedri here. Lovely to see everybody. So it's always really fun when the symposium have like a widely different things, and I think we'll be just ahead of time. Actually, my findings actually quite different from Daniel's, and I think that's going to be like the fun part as well. So I'm going to be talking about, obviously, about culture and relational thinking, and specifically focusing on the relational thinking aspect. And I want to start with what I call the tale of relational versus object thinking. So, as is known for many of you in the symposium, that there is a well-known tension between relations and objects, and we found this with young children. So here's a really quick demonstration. If you give the standard on top and you ask young children, like, what actually is the match? Majority of 4-year-olds, even 5-year-olds, will actually choose the object match and not the relational match. This is actually also true for adults. So this is one of the classic studies from Markman and Gantner in 1993, where people are asked to do a one-shot. It's called a one-shot mapping task. So given if I ask what actually corresponds to the woman on the top picture, what actually corresponds in the bottom picture, if you do it by analogical mapping, then you should choose the woman is the receiver, so you should choose it with the squirrel, that's a little squirrel there. But 40% of adults actually chose to map woman to woman, so that's object mapping. So this is the background of the tale of relational versus object. This is well known, and it's it's used in a lot of tasks, and I think Lindsey probably will use this task too. So this is actually, this tale continues a little bit. I moved to China not long ago. So about 3 years ago, I moved to China from Swarthmore all the way to Beijing. And this is a new country for me, a new culture for me. I speak the language a little bit. I speak the language, but I studied it as a linguistic, hobby. So it's not my culture. And so I thought, as a psychologist, what I should first do is to actually understand the culture. And what could be better than understanding the culture than reading about psychology literature about the culture. And of course, as Daniel has given us to very clearly, that one of the most enduring differences is between East and West, found in cultural psychology. And as I read many of these papers, I started making object mapping myself, because the first paper I read was actually this Na et al. Paper, 2010. It's also by Nisbet and colleagues. And you got things like people with an interdependent orientation are more sensitive to relational cues, such as emotion in daily communication. I read another paper by Nisbet and Peng and Choi and Noren Sayan, where basically Chinese in particular reason in holistic and relational way. Another paper by Oliveira and Nisbet said that collectivism would mold thinking into a more context-focused relational patterns found in dialectalism. Here is a result from the another paper at G et al. Even in the graph, it's directly called relational versus something else. So in this case, relational versus categorical groupings. The Chinese, Taiwanese Chinese, and Chinese in the United States shows more relational pattern than categorical pattern. So the word relational occurs in almost every paper that I read about East versus West. And of course, Daniel has set up the point, as he said, it's obligatory to put up this picture. So I'm also putting up this picture. But what I'm really, because of these relational word appears in so many things and so many claims, my first reaction is also the same as Daniel's reaction. Well, in that case, then it should be that Easterners should be better in analogical reasoning. So that is actually, and I wanted to ask that, and much like Daniel, I found that there's actually no one has actually tested this directly. Just as a little note, my student Junhao Zhang, who's doing all this work, actually we presented this work in Cognition, like, oh, next door is actually Daniel's work. So it was great to see that finally we're getting to test this. So my question is focused on the relational, on the background of relational versus object thinking, and that is whether relational holistic and relational analogy, they're both called relational, and I think it's right for us to suspect they might be the same. But I actually want to ask, are they the same? And if so, are they identical? Are they related, right? So is relational holistic the same as relational analogy? In which case, we should expect that East Asians, and I'm going to testing Chinese because it's a convenient sample for me, who is more holistic, have been found in many studies, they should also be more analogical. So I'm going to present 3 series of studies that look at these particular questions. This work are done by my graduate student, Junhao Zhang. So our logic is relatively simple. Of course, so we are testing US participants in mainland US. So we tested this online, but we make sure that they come from mainland US, and Chinese participants in mainland China. We have a relatively large sample as well. And we wanted to, in order to ask the question, whether relational holistic is the same as relational analogy, then we wanted to test them using classic holistic analytic tasks and classic analogy tasks. So our first choice of using the classic holistic analytic task is the thematic taxonomic triad task by G et al. In 2004. This is a very simple task, so it's very pragmatic for us in order to do it online as well. So in this task, participants simply had to indicate which two of the three things are most closely related. Panda, banana, monkey. You have to choose two out of these three. Okay. So originally this task was the authors of this task, Xie et al. Said that if you are choosing monkey, banana, then that means you're choosing thematically, and that is a relational response. If you're choosing monkey, panda, then you're choosing taxonomically, and that is not a relational response. So this was the graph that I showed you before that really attracted my attention, how the characterization of East Asians to be more relational. And so this is an interesting task for us because as an analogist, you also would notice that taxonomic is also a relation, right? So this task was interesting because it has been sort of very well established that these tell us that that East Asians are more relational. On the other hand, if you actually really question what is relational, well, taxonomic is another kind of relation. Okay. So we wanted to know what happened given that you can be either way relational to your analogical thinking. We also supplement our holistic analytic task with what is called self-construal scale. These scales is where participants rated statements about interdependence and independence. So there are statements about how likely it is that you rate your interdependence, and basically higher score indicates higher interdependence. This is a scale that's used very commonly in the East-West literature, so a very established scale. On the classic analogy task, of course, we have to use the scene analogy task. So this is one of the classic analogy tasks. These are all with adults. So we use the original stimuli from Markman and Gettner, 1993, the mapping task, where participants had to indicate what actually corresponds to the top picture. And all tasks are done in mobile phones. So participants see categorization tasks, 10 trials, and they indicate which two of the three. And then they see analogy tasks, which object in the picture below is more similar to the object pointed by the arrow in the picture above. These two tasks, categorization tasks and analogy tasks, are done within subjects, and they are done in blocks, and we counterbalance. So half of the groups see analogy first, the other half of the group see categorization first. And then this is followed by a third task, which is the self-construal. So the self-construal is always appeared last, and they rated on the statements about independence and interdependence. Okay, so this is the task using a classic task, and our prediction, of course, is that in the thematic taxonomic task, we predicted to replicate the prior findings, the many prior findings, that participants in China would be more thematic than participants in the US, and participants in China will be less thematic than participants in the US, will be less taxonomic than participants in the US. We also expect that participants in China to have a higher, to score higher in the self-construal scale, meaning they have a higher holistic rating, and so they are more holistic. What we don't know, because it hasn't been done, of course, is in the analogy. However, our prediction is that given that relational, if relational holistic is the same as relational analogy, then we should predict that participants in China to be better, to be more likely than participants in the US to choose relational matches. Okay. So this is our, so what did we find? Basically, we replicated all the prior studies of the East-West thing. That is that on the thematic taxonomic task, we did find that the Chinese participants are more thematic So this is significant. And US participants also chose more taxonomic choices compared to Chinese participants. So we replicated the findings about East-West differences. These findings are also replicated in the self-construal scale, another holistic analytic task. So you can see that also here I'm showing you again higher score, meaning that you are more interdependent, because this is interdependent minus independent. So higher bar means more interdependent, lower bar more independence. And I'm also showing you that it doesn't matter whether you do analogy first or category first. Participants are the same. Chinese participants are more holistic, more interdependent. US participants are more independent. So this is also replicated. Okay. Also, the interdependent score is positively correlated with the thematic choice. And so this is to be expected as well. So pretty much we replicated the findings, the East-West differences of holistic. The Easterners are more holistic. Chinese participants are more holistic. However, when we got to the analogy, we find no difference. Chinese participants and US participants answered almost identical. That's like, there's almost no difference. It's very, very identical. Very importantly, however, these answers are not at chance. In fact, this is actually where there is a robust pattern here. As you recall, the scene analogy mapping task pitted relations and objects. And we see very clearly that there is a strong tendency to choose the object choice. Both for Chinese participants and the US participants. They do not differ in their relational choice, neither do they differ in their object choice. So overall, there is no difference in the analogy test. Okay. So we found that, and I couldn't quite believe the results. So so I said it's good that we replicated the East-West differences, but okay, let's do it again. Maybe there's something about there's something the way we run it. So let's just make sure. So I asked my graduate student, like, actually replicate it. We ran another close to 100 on each side, 86 US participants, 114 Chinese participants, again, Chinese mainland China, and also from the US. We tested the same classic holistic analytic task. So in terms of the holistic analytic task, this is identical to study 1, which just tested new group of participants. In terms of the analogy, the classic analogy task, we also use again the same scene analogy task. The only thing that we change is the instruction, because before we asked which object in the picture below is most similar to the object pointed by the arrow above. And then we change this, which object in the picture below goes with the object pointed by the arrow above. In Chinese, the first study is with 相似, and then whereas in the second study is with 匹配. So these, I've done quite a number of pilot studies before, particularly with the language. There's a whole set of studies that I have done trying to understand the linguistic translations of similarity terms. And we pretty much know that these similar, the Chinese equivalent translation of similar and goes with are really these two. But what we don't know is whether this will have any effect. Pretty much, we replicated again the East-West differences. So we again find that there is a difference between the Chinese and US. The Chinese participants are more thematic. The US participant chose more taxonomic choice. Also, we replicated again the self-construal scale. Chinese participants are more interdependent, and US participants are more independent. Okay, and we also replicated again the analogy task. So even though we change the language, we again find that Chinese participants and US participants do not differ in their analogy mapping. So they again overwhelmingly chose the object rather than the relational choice, and there's no difference between the two cultures that we tested. Okay. So in study 3, I wanted to do another replication, but with a different holistic analytic task. So trying to really understand, so far we do not cannot claim that relational, holistic, and relational analogy are the same thing. But one of the things that we want to understand is whether holistic thinking also has plurality. So maybe part of this holistic thinking are the ones that more directly related to relational analogical thinking. So, so this is obviously only part of like the big picture. So this is only part of the first kinds of another applications that we did. So we tested new groups of subjects, US and China. And this time we are actually using a different holistic analytic task. And this is it's called the Rule versus Family Categorization task from Zheng, 2004. So this task where participants are asked to categorize the target object. And Zheng and colleagues call this into a rule. So if you categorize the task object at the bottom to group 1, then because of the stem, the presence of the stem, then you categorize this based on a rule. If you categorize it based on to group 2, that is called what he called family resemblance. Okay. Now, this term like rule versus family, this is another, I should say, this is another interesting nomenclature uses in the East-West differences that as people who are for us who are working in an analogy and relational thinking, I think some of these are really interesting because you can also, in one way, the rule is also more of an object match. Like there is also an object match between within the stem. So so it's a little unclear like what actually. But nevertheless, it was the prior findings, and we wanted to know that. And this was the prior results from Zheng et al. And also replicated by some other people. And so, as you can see, the prior result shows that European Americans use rule more, so they will categorize this test object into group 1. And Asian American is Asians are more likely to categorize it based on family resemblance. That was the first holistic analytic task. The second one, we also did another scale. This is also an established scale. It's called the analysis holism scale. And this scale basically, again, measured your holistic, but your self-construal, whether you're more holistic or analytic. And this is also widely used in the East-West literature. So we changed the holistic analytic task. We do not change the analogy task. So we don't want to change both things at the same time. So for this study, we still use the scene analogy task. Okay. That's the study was done as before using mobile phones. The reason why we use mobile phones is because in China, most people are actually using mobile phones rather than computers. So we make sure that this is actually uniformized. So even participants in the US using an amphitheater are required to use mobile phones, and we did check this. Okay. I mentioned this because this our predictions is that, again, we should replicate it. So we expected that the Chinese participants to choose more family resemblance than the US participants, whereas as well as they're more holistic, even though using a different scale from study 1 and 2. Because we have found in study 1 and 2 that the Chinese and US participants do not differ, our prediction for study 3 is that they again should not differ because this is using the same analogies scene mapping task. Okay. This is the results. For this one, we actually do not replicate the Zheng results. So on the category task, choosing based on rule or family resemblance, we didn't find any difference between Chinese and US participants. And it's possible because you can see that people are just choosing 50-50. So we're suspecting that it might be that the mobile phone presentation, particularly for this task, might not be really good. Maybe it's too small of a screen or something like this. We are currently conducting this study on computers, both in mainland China and in the US, to check whether this is the case. So we don't find, we don't replicate the Zheng at all in the East-West differences in this case. However, we did replicate the scale. So remember, we use a different scale for study 3 than study 1 and 2, but this is another established scale measuring analytic and holistic, and we replicated the East-West differences that have been found in many studies. The Chinese participants are more holistic. This is to the left ones is overall. To the right are all the subcomponents of the scale, and we found differences in at least 2 of the subcomponents. But overall, we find differences. The bottom line is Chinese participants are more holistic than the US participants. So we replicated this scale, and again, when we do a scene analogy mapping task for the 3rd time, we replicated the non-difference between Chinese and US participants. The percentage of choosing object choice is still very high, just the same as before. Again, no difference between cultures. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. In summary, what we found is that we replicated the East-West cognitive style differences using the classic tests, at least most and classic scales. Chinese participants are more holistic than US participants. However, at this point, at least, I mean, of course, more studies to be done. At this point, my view is that holistic relational is not the same as analogical relational. Chinese and US participants, the evidence that I have gathered suggests to me that Chinese and US participants do not differ in scene analogy mapping tasks across 3 studies. And they do not differ just because they are all random, but in fact, they do not differ in the same way. And that is both Chinese and US participants chose object matches. Sorry, this is a mistake. It should be around 80%. So I mean, relational matches at 20%, object matches at around 80%. So this is the results from all 3 studies. And you can see, so this is like a total of, more than like 1,000 people that we have tested by this point. The Chinese and US participants are very similar across all 3 studies, even though with some different language instructions, and it's overwhelmingly choosing object. And so, the title of my talk started with like culture and relational thinking, and that's why I gave a background of the tale of relational versus object, because maybe something that we have to consider is also about culture and relational versus object thinking. So in the presence of object thinking, which is a very important aspect of relational thinking, we do not find that these East Asians are more relational than Westerners at this point. And I want to offer 2 possibilities about how this happened. At this point, these are conjectures, but we need to start conjecturing, given that we have a couple of like different results. The first one that we heard from Daniel's talk, were really wonderful talk that Chinese actually in the particularly in the Ravens task is actually much better than the US participants. Okay, so possibility 1 is that attention to relation per se does differ across cultures. Asians attend more to relations between objects compared to Westerners. In fact, Alex, who's here, and Caren, papers like recently with young children actually shows this developmentally. The Chinese children are again better than the US children. Recently, we also wrote a reviewing all the findings, particularly from developmental, and we did see a couple of other work showing that on relations per se, East Asians are better. Even though the attention to relation per se differ across culture, greater attention to relation does not privilege relational similarity over object similarity. And at this point, I think many of you should be like, huh? What are you talking about? I mean, isn't like all the papers that we have talked about, that we have read, including the papers that I myself have wrote, usually say greater attention to relations, foster relational similarity. And so how could you offer, like say that a relation doesn't privilege relational similarity, attention to relation doesn't privilege relational similarity. And I am currently puzzling over this, but let me offer you another conjecture that might be kind of like the answer to why attention to relation does not automatically privilege relational similarity. Again, this is a possibility, and I'm exploring this possibility. We see that from the, this is a summary from Varnum et al. 2010 about the holistic versus analytic difference. And that is like, again, when we look at the attention, this is something that's really important, that the attention in the holistic cognition focus on relationship of elements and background. And that's what, of course, what initially made me think that they should do better on relational similarity as well. And so how could it possibly not? And so this is possibility number 2. And is that, again, the attention to relation per se does differ across culture, but maybe only in the beginning. And we see, so there is a developmental difference in the East-West. And again, Caren's and Alex Carson's work have shown this. And I think Lindsey are going to talk about this as well. And what I'm conjecturing is, though, it's possible that this attention to relation over time becomes object. So the relation becomes object. And this is what I'm calling sticky relation. And what do I mean by sticky relation? So I'm going to take these, suppose that you are actually looking at the Markman and Gardner things, and you have to process it. And so if you look at the top picture, then you're going to process it. Okay, there is a man who's giving something to the woman. So give with predicates man and woman. You should abstract this somehow to give and giver and givee, which allows you to see how the woman in the first picture is going to correspond to the woman, to the squirrel, and not to the woman, because they are both in the givee relations, right? In the givee role. And what I'm conjecturing is that it's possible that relation can actually become objects over time. And that is because you kind of bypass the give relation, and you just directly, there is a relation between men and women. And we have a relation between men and women, all these other abstractions will be gone, and you will be left with just the man and woman relation. And that's what I mean by sticky relation. Okay, so we are doing a number of works currently in the lab to try to understand whether this conjecture is a true possibility that might give away why attention to relation per se may not be automatically privileging relational similarity. So stay tuned for more results, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella, for the very intriguing talk and the possibilities. And now we will turn to our third presenter, Lindsey Richland, and her talk will be about socialization and maturations, the mechanism of analogy development. So Lindsey Richland is an associate professor at the University of California, Irvine, and director of the Science of Learning Lab. Dr. Richland's research examines the ways that children develop complex reasoning skills. She examines children's reasoning development in and out of school with her classroom research focusing on teaching and learning mathematics. She examined the mechanisms underpinning children's capacity to think flexibly, with studies focusing on the role of cognitive maturation and individual differences, primary giver language, and socialization practice, cultural influence, and school routines. She also examines factors shaping children's tendencies to engage in higher order thinking when opportunities are available. Lindsey, please take the floor.
Okay, thank you, Sean. This is such a treat, such a fun session. It's really fun to hear the rest of you guys. So thank you for including me. So let's see, I think we get that. Okay. So yeah, so I kind of played with my title, thinking about, really what I think is interesting and important is to try to recognize the role of culture in cognition. So that's, I think, the way that I conceptualize the use of cross-cultural work, because sometimes that helps us identify things that we don't maybe always see, right? When you know, in the ether of your culture, you might not notice where some variability might come. Another way to do it is by sort of doing observation and deep looking within a culture. So we've done some of that too. But so I want to start by thinking about what does it look like to do analogy in everyday settings, you know? So if we're going to be thinking about acculturation, we're talking about culture here, you know, what does that mean? I mean, growing up, you know, living in some area, there may be features of your context that are important, but one of the big features of your context is the social structure, right? These interactional practices, you know, sort of modes of engagement that you have between individuals. So, okay, so just to put in your head, like, what does it look like to do analogy in everyday settings? Let's look at a cute kid video, right? That always helps. So, so here's one of a child. This is from a sample of videotaped child-parent spontaneous interactions that were located in Chicago as part of a longitudinal study. So, okay, so here's one.
They're looking in the mirror. There's a tomato! There's a tomato!
What happens in a tornado, Grace?
The tomato is something else, like a quinoa. Looks like a green monster.
The tornado looks like a mean monster.
Okay, so a couple of things here, right? So this, you know, cute interaction, this nice analogy between really abstract things, right? They don't look like each other. Tornado does not really look like a monster. It's got, you know, it doesn't have these features. So this child is really the one who came up with this, which is really important. But you see also the parent, you know, the child says, there's a tornado. The parent could say, oh, you know, or like, ah, or, you know, kind of get into it. But instead, she's sort of pushing her child to interrogate a little bit, like, what happens within a tornado, right? And interestingly, the child then responds with this kind of an analogy. So this child is sort of using this seemingly in this way to support understanding and explaining the world. So these kinds of spontaneous interactions, when structured in different ways, can support different kinds of thinking and reasoning. So that's one argument. And I'm not going to talk about this data today, but we do show that the more children generate these kinds of relations, these kinds of, we call them higher order thinking talk kinds of opportunities, these kinds of comparisons, they're scoring better on things like Ravens and more psychometric measures later in their later childhood. So this seems to be a really important place of socializing our cognition, right? So these kinds of home socialization contexts may have important implications for what kids are doing and maybe attending to later. So, you know, I love these findings. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, I guess, in terms of in the two studies that we're going to talk about. Okay, so how about things like teaching practices, right? So this is another context where you have intentional socialization. So you have people who are in classrooms aiming to change children's cognition, and they're aiming to change particular content area, content knowledge, right? But teachers also, we know, you know, lots of work suggests that there's really a lot of culture embedded in the way we teach, and there's sort of these routines and normative practices that are common within teachers within a cultural context. So these data come from the Third International Mathematics and Science Study, old data now, and they're so old that actually I tried to play this video and it doesn't work. So I'm going to try to just run the audio and tell you about the video because it's actually really important. But basically this was collected from this random probability sample of 8th grade mathematics lessons collected in countries around the world, but we particularly looked at the ones in the US, Hong Kong, and Japan because the teaching practices were very common within the teachers, but very different from each other and different from the US. And so here's a nice example. We coded every time that we found a relational comparison within the lessons, and we found a lot of them. But they had some interesting features. So I'm going to play this one. This is a teacher who has on the board, I don't know if you can read it, so a convex hexagon on one side and a concave polygon on the other side. And this teacher has just asked students to figure out what's different about them. So what does it mean to have a convex hexagon, right? Something to be convex. And so I'll kind of narrate, but he just imagine he's doing a lot of gesture and going back and forth and pointing to, what's on the board. Okay.
Your neighbor, you should tell him because you discuss together. Can you come on? What? Yes. What does it mean? What does it mean?
More than 180 degrees.
More than 180 degrees. Okay, it means this angle is more than 180 degrees. How about this polygon? Can we find any angles more than 180 degrees? No. Okay, can you get the meaning of your thank you. Your classmate say?
Yeah.
Okay, what are the difference between convex polygon and concave polygon? We look at the concave polygon. At least one or more of the interior angle is greater than 180 degrees. We call concave polygon. Understand? But in this chapter, we don't discuss the concave polygon. We just only discuss the convex polygon. Okay?
Okay, so this teacher has set up this whole interaction to talk about concave versus convex polygons. And at the end says, so basically don't pay any attention to that. We're just going to be talking about convex hexagons. Now, many of you guys are from, different countries, different regions, but this is not something that a US teacher would do. A US teacher would say, today is a lesson on convex hexagons. Let me tell you what the definition is. Let me show you a bunch of them. Here's what we do, right? So setting up this kind of a rich comparison is really interesting. So and you can see that he's got a lot of support behind this, right? He's really drawing this attention out for the students. So what we found basically very quickly is we found lots of relational comparisons. We found no difference in frequency between the countries, but what teachers did was really different. And we quoted lots of things, and here's a collapsed story, which basically is that the US teachers did the least work to make sure that people notice the relations versus when compared to the Hong Kong and Japanese teachers. So the ways that they did that work were things like gesture, putting things on the board next to each other, spending a lot of time, highlighting and comparing these sort of correspondences. And I can say more about that, but it sort of gives us this idea that there are sort of qualitative differences in the way that countries and regions may be drawing attention to relations. So maybe we can think about this as one of these mechanisms that's actually guiding some cultural differences that we see. Now, whether we see them on all analogy tasks, I think is a super interesting question and one that we want to really interrogate. And part of what we can think about is if analogies are everywhere, and we can think about, what's important is to think about what the mechanisms might be, right, that are actually changing this. So what do you need to do to solve an analogy problem? So here's one that we've used a lot, this kind of task, where we ask, children and parents to talk about what goes in this extra spot. So sort of a simple matrix task. And you have, these nuts are eaten by squirrels, these muffins are eaten by, and so, the intended answer is the girl. That's the relational answer. However, you could reasonably see this as a color matching task, right? Brown, brown, gray, gray. And we do this kinds of task without telling people what they should be doing. And what is interesting here, if you think about what's supposed to go here, you need a lot of content knowledge, right? You also need to be attending to relations that may not be at the same, that may not be also showing relational correspondence, right? And sometimes these are different. Sometimes these are actually, pointing you in different directions, these kinds of object similarity and object matches. Like here, you could have an object match, right? If you're, thinking about something similar. So these are explaining the sorts of ways that children's attention gets modulated. And we can use this to guide some of the questions that we ask when we're looking cross-culturally. So if we think about different mechanisms, we can think about prior knowledge as one reason we might see differences. We can think about cognitive maturation or executive resources, so ability to disattend to these object properties and object correspondences, and to intentionally guide your own attention to what you think is most important or what might be most task relevant. But then you also have all this socialization piece, right, which is about sort of how children are creating their relational knowledge base, what might be opportunities for doing, thinking, and sort of cultural experiences that might shape your attention to relations. And they may shape your attention to specific kinds of relations, or alternatively to specific sort of frames and ways of looking at relations. So I guess I'm just going to kind of breeze through a couple of different studies. I wanted to talk a little bit about work that is sort of making the case that cognition and reasoning is malleable and is socialized, and is sort of corresponds to the nature of children's environments. So this work actually we're going to move to a different part of the world, to Nicaragua. And this is work that was conducted by my student, Lainey Volman. And she was working with a group and a data set that I worked with to develop measures that tested that are sort of culturally specific, culturally relevant measures to capture reasoning, as well as a whole host of other cognitive capacities and skills in a set of Latin American and South American countries. So in Nicaragua, it's an interesting context because it's a very multi-ethnic population, very low income. The poverty level is very high, and these data are a little bit old, so I don't actually know what's going on. I think it's probably challenged right now, but. So when we looked at that, you have to think very carefully about how you create a wealth index in a context like this. So we did that and developed this scale that's a cognitive battery. And I'm going to sort of focus our attention today on a matrix reasoning task that's in there. And one thing that Lainey did is she took a large amount of data that we had about each of the families, and so these were data that were collected that had been sort of taken from other measures collected in other parts of the world, to understand kind of the nature of children's home environments. And so these were things like, how many activities do you do with your child? These are parent surveys. And then how many books are in the home? How many rules do you have for your children and for your household? What kind of hygiene practices do you maintain? And then a second piece was about social interactions. And it's sort of collapsed into frequency of interactions. And these could be interactions with parents, with siblings, with peers, because unlike, for example, in the United States, you see a lot more peer-to-peer or child sibling to sibling kinds of interactions, as well as extended family. So we want to know, what are these things important? These are things that have been highlighted. You have more language context when you have more of these social interactions. All of this, and basically, I won't go through all that, and I'll just sort of highlight that education matters. So you think about prior knowledge changing reasoning skills. You can focus on this reasoning measure, but also the structure, these kinds of structure characteristics of the home, and the level of social interaction all predicted growth in reasoning skills. And when you did this, basically, it becomes, I think, a very useful way of understanding the fact that children in these very different environments are actually, being guided and being impacted in ways that shows up in a reasoning task. And just to think about the relation to SES, I think I really like this figure because it highlights that even at the lowest SES, sort of the lowest wealth community, those families where there was the highest of the structure characteristic, you see, the same level of cognitive practice, the cognitive, and so this is a collapsing of the all of the cognitive tasks, but you see this level of cognitive skills. So ultimately what this suggests to me is that these aren't comparative data, but in this other cultural context, it allows us to really identify the fact that you see these routines, you see the social context that's guiding and changing reasoning skills. So, social context, socialization seems to really matter for reasoning skills. And that's one way of quantifying a kind of socialization practice that seems important. Now, if we want to move to something that's a little more of a formal context, we can think about this is the child version of the picture scene analogy task that Stella just described. And here we did, I'll just draw attention to one other thing that we did with the materials. We have the same sort of competition between an object in the top picture and an object in the bottom picture. So this is a scolding relation. So you have child scolding a doll, mom scolding a dog. So, the relational correspondence would be the scolder to the scolder, right? But then you have this distracting object match as well. We also included, so I have somehow I realize it's a different picture, but anyway, we also changed the level of relational complexity. So here you have two relations going on: dog chasing cat, cat chasing a mouse. Whereas here you have one relation, right, going on. So we were able to vary systematically and the level of relational complexity of this task, in addition to this object matching. So in this work, we find that when you look, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. I'm realizing I'm taking a while, so I'm trying to get through some information. But what we see here is that what we wanted to look at was whether there were cross-cultural differences in these scene analogy tasks, and whether we would see greater attention to relations, as Stella was positing, in a Chinese sample than in the US sample. We also were interested in level of relational complexity, and to understand whether it's a community where, where theoretically there's greater attention to relation within the socialization practice, you might see greater ability to handle relational material, right, relational information than in the US data set. And so we did this work with preschoolers in Hong Kong. And here we manipulated both relational complexity and inhibitory control demands, so attention to this object distractor. And basically we find, mapped in a different way, but we see really similar things to what you just saw in Stella's talk. Really happy to know this replicated, so, or at least in a different sample in different ways. But here you see when there was no distractor, children were doing quite well. When there was an object distractor at the bottom, so when there was those two object matches, you see that they were really picking that object match. So I actually maybe didn't say this. So we varied. We had 4 versions. So one version where there was no girl, this was a different object. So we could really systematically manipulate whether or not there was a distractor versus no distractor. We also looked at when there was relational complexity. And interestingly here, what we found is that the US children, when we replicated this, and we have seen this many times, that when there are 2 relations going on, the children fall to chance. But in the Hong Kong population, there was no difference. These children didn't change regardless of the level of relational complexity. So we argued that here it seems to be there seems to be maybe some kind of a difference between the ability to handle relational complexity and the attention to object similarity. So, maybe there's a maturation component and sort of ability to draw your attention away from what seem to be these very salient object matches. But the fact that there were no age-related changes in relational complexity maybe really speaks to the idea that there isn't that this could be something you could socialize, right? This could be something that could be really with greater experience with relations, one might become more able to handle relational complexity. Okay, so then that brought us to a study that Sean, who had brought us all together today, collected the data for and designed. So in this study, this was another study comparing the US and China and looking at children in these populations. And here the question was, when you, in the previous task, we told kids they were supposed to be attending to relations, and they still couldn't do it, right? They still paid attention to these objects, but we wanted to capture whether there were differences when you didn't tell them what to do, and they were sort of spontaneously looking at these scene analogies. And so again, this is pretty similar data to what you heard, but we have a trick in our study, in our manipulation. So what we did is we had 3 blocks. So in the first block, there were these kinds of object matches as well as relational matches, right? So here's one that's a 2-relation match and a 2-relation, a 2-relation source and a 2-relation target. And there was also an object match. So you see there are more relational objects going on here than object. So we kind of thought maybe we were really orienting kids towards attending to relations. So they did 3 trials like that. Then there was a second block where there was no longer an object match. And so here, if children had been picking the object match, then they wouldn't have that option there. So we were curious what they would do. And we also wanted to know whether then they would, if you're attentive to the task constraints and the roles of relational versus object similarity information, you might then realize, oh, relational information is actually more informative here. And maybe that's something that you would want to attend to a little more. So then we had a third block where there was both, again, a relational match and an object match. And so the real test was what they did at this point. I mean, it was all, it was very interesting to know what they did on the first and the third blocks. And so we collected these data. And basically, when you look at age, that's really where you see the action. So very interestingly, in this first block, most kids were all, and by relational accuracy, this means whether they picked the relational match, most kids did not. Most of them were picking the object match. When you got to having no object match, more kids picked the relation, particularly the oldest group. And when you went back to having no object match, kids, the youngest group went right back to picking that object match, whereas the oldest group sort of held on to picking the relational match. So it seemed that this older group had actually abstracted from the task that relational information was more important here than the perceptual object match information. And when you look at the data, it's a little hard to look at here, but when you look cross-culturally, you see really very little difference. And so we really find the same thing that Stella did, where actually both groups of samples were not spontaneously different in what they were attending to. Most were all attending to the object match. And in fact, these tiny kids, you can see here, this orange is bigger than this orange. They were actually attending to the object match more. So they're not statistically, but there wasn't a hint of this, sort of greater attention to relations. And then at the end block, you see actually the same phenomenon. But so the big difference is by age. So it's really these older kids that were recognizing the task relevance of relations. So overall, I think this is really suggestive of the fact that you don't have these global, at least on this sort of a scene, a task, right? When you have this perceptual information, you're not seeing this kind of global attention to relations that, or not global, but cultural, that varies, systematically. But rather maybe maturation, experience, something about tasks seems to be really being more explanatory in terms of performance differences. Now, if we think about specific kinds of relations, I can't find my cursor. Okay, when we think about specific kinds of relations, we talked about math, right? This is an area where we're getting a lot of socialization in math, and we know that there are some cultural differences in what the context of the classroom seems to be. So I'll just really quickly go through a little some data that my postdoc collected and is published before. This is work with Patricia Anderson. And basically what she did is looked at cross-cultural study of spontaneous attention to quantitative relations. So when you have quantitative relations in the context of also object match information and perceptual and other kinds of relational information, what are kids attending to? And so I'm just gonna skip ahead so that I can kind of cut to the chase. So this is a task that was developed actually by a Finnish researcher. And so he collected data in Finland, and then she collected data in a Chinese sample. And you see these, had a cover story of teleportation. There was a set of stimuli that then, changed in some ways when it teleported over to this other planet. And what you can see is that, the objects changed color, they changed shape, so they squished, and they also changed in a multiplicative quantitative relation. So you could do sort of an approximate number difference. You see this is just less. You could also look at this in a multiplicative way and recognize sort of how in particularly, this is half, right? And then they had a series of distractor options that allowed them to see whether they could differentiate between whether children were mapping on the basis of these quantitative relations. Were they noticing these quantitative relations, or were they attending more preferentially to these kinds of object comparisons? And basically they did attend to the quantitative information, and there was a systematic difference between the Chinese children and the Finnish children in attention to these multiplicative quantitative relations. So this was pretty interesting and suggests that, there may not be these overall relational attention differences, but maybe when you're getting particular kinds of inputs, particular kinds of attention, that may be driving a change in attention. When you look by grade level, you see this sort of developmental growth in the Finnish sample, like you might expect, sort of greater attention to these complex relations, but really very little growth in the sample in China. So this again suggests that this ability to handle these sort of multiple kinds of relations here may be more tied to experience and socialization than maturation. Because if it was maturation, you sort of expect this common developmental trajectory across settings. So I think I will end there. If I can get my screen to go there, it doesn't seem to want to. Let's see. I'm not sure why it doesn't want to go there. So yeah, okay, there we go. So basically though, what we see is that relational reasoning seems to be this common core part of everyday home and school language. We see it in these places, and thus is sort of a part of really the key socialization that communities are doing with their children. But it seems like, from what I would argue from these is that we see this relational attention being organized toward object similarity, even across cultures. But with age, you see more sensitivity to task constraints that will tell you that a relation seems to be important. But that being said, there may be contexts where children are particularly getting inputs that guide their attention to focus more on relations. So, for example, math being one of them, where you have these Chinese children more attentive to quantitative relations. And then you have younger children who are more able to handle these complex relations. This suggests together that classroom instruction, maybe intentional parent socialization, maybe more experience with relational information makes you able to do more complex relational sort of practices and skills a little bit earlier. Okay, I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Lindsey, for the wonderful talk. At this point, I'm sure we are all filled with questions and thoughts and comments. And now I'm glad to introduce Dr. Caren Walker as the lead discussant for our panel discussion. Caren Walker is an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego, and the director of the Early Learning and Cognition Lab. Dr. Walker's research explores how children learn and reason about the causal structure of the world. In particular, she is interested in how even very young learners are able to acquire abstract representations that extend beyond their observations simply by thinking. How is learning by thinking possible? What does this phenomenon tell us about the nature of the early mental representations and how they change? To investigate these questions, Dr. Walker's work focused on a suite of activities that impose top-down constraint on human inferences. For example, analogy, explanation, and engagement in the imaginary world. Her work also explored the development of scientific thinking and reasoning, including children's understanding of uncertainty. Caren Walker, please take the floor.
Do you guys see my slides or do you see my excellent? Okay, hi guys, I'm gonna try to go real quick because we're running low on time and I wanna make sure that there's plenty of time for Q&A. So my goal for the panel discussion is basically just to explore some potential points of contact, maybe some points of divergence among your findings, and brainstorm, hopefully some potential ways forward that integrate some of the ideas that you guys have been talking about. So I'll do my best to do that in a very short amount of time here. So just to start here, we're sort of looking at this intersection, right, between relational reasoning and cross-cultural research. And in the case of Lindsey's and Stella's work, also sort of how it intersects with childhood development, right? So if you think about it, this is a relatively small intersection here. But even so, right, the literature here is relatively sparse to date. All of the findings are sort of pretty carefully scoped, even though the ones today overlap a bit, right? But they sort of remain separated from one another. So, you know, to those of you who are listening today, you should consider this a call to action, right? There's a lot of work to sort of unpack here still. And I think that, you know, there's plenty to do. It sort of in the meantime, I think, you know, we'll take a look at some of the major findings that were covered today to begin this sort of larger conversation about mechanisms. I think I'm going to mostly skip through the summary since it's probably fresh in your mind, right? But I'll just sort of flash these slides up really quickly, right? So we saw, you know, Daniel sort of began by asking us to think about what counts as abstract thinking, sort of beyond this initial claim about formal logic. And he gave us some really nice findings here that suggest some pretty clear differences between the US and China and also within China, right? In these sort of subcultural contexts as well. He leaves open the question of whether these differences are reflecting something that's specific, right, to abstract cognition or sort of broader, which is something that I hope we'll come back to later in the discussion. Stella questioned this claim, right, that relational thinking is sort of essentially this one kind of monolith concept. And instead, right, she asked whether it's really the case that reasoning relationally in terms of holistic and interdependent thinking is really the same thing as reasoning relationally in terms of analogy, right? And so although she's kind of replicated these thematic taxonomic triad tasks showing the expected result, she doesn't really see any differences, at least in the scene analogy task here, right? And instead, you know, people across cultural contexts seem to prefer or pay attention to objects here, right? Lindsey's talk took a little bit of a different approach. So she argues that this cross-cultural data should help us to understand and kind of pull apart these different effects, right? These effects of socialization on analogical reasoning, and also these other effects, things like general factors like cognitive maturation and executive resources. She talks, her work is super interesting, right? She talks about all these aspects of socialization that might differ across contexts. And, you know, she also provided us with some data. So like Stella, she didn't find any clear differences across cultures in the sort of primary feature of the seam mapping task. However, she does report some interesting differences in this quantitative relational reasoning task, right? And argues that those might in fact be tied to these kinds of socialization factors. So at the end of her, it went quickly there at the end, but she was sort of concluding, right, that relational attention is this thing that's kind of malleable, that can be potentially influenced in a number of ways by cultural factors. And she also argues elsewhere that since object features remain super salient, right, learners also really have to exert some sort of attentional control, right, over their reasoning in order to ensure that they're paying attention to relations in these tasks. So she's sort of arguing that these are potentially related but separate paths to the development of this kind of analogical and relational thinking, one that's sort of common and then one that differs, right? Does that seem fair, Lindsey? Okay. Excellent. So to begin our discussion, I want to start with Lindsey's approach here. So, I'm curious whether you think that this approach of considering multiple pathways, either the ones that Lindsey suggests or others, right? I don't think we don't have to stick necessarily to those. Do you think these might help to sort of unify or unite these different perspectives that have been pitched here by Stella and by Daniel, where Stella is sort of arguing that these differences in holistic and analytic thinking are unrelated, distinct from performance and analogical reasoning, while I think what Daniel wants to do is integrate these things, right? He wants to integrate these differences in holistic and analytic thinking with some of these cross-cultural differences that we observe in analogical reasoning as well. So maybe we can start, maybe we can start here with Lindsey. This is my first sort of big question. So what do you think? Do you see your approach as sort of considering multiple pathways a means for unifying the data that we see here?
Yes, and I love how you framed it. That was kind of where I was trying to go. So yes, that's exactly, I think so. I was thinking about that as I was listening to the other, studies. And then, I don't know, Stella, your ideas about this sort of sticky relations are really interesting, and thinking about, when relations become less challenging to hold in mind, you sort of, as you're building expertise, they become less cognitively challenging as well, right? Because you can sort of have these more complex relations, they sort of get chunked. And I think we get good at chunking not only well-known relations, but maybe we also build the skill of sort of just pulling together and sort of using new relations in these complex ways as well, which may be also guiding some of the changes that you see, or the differences that Daniel is seeing, right? So, sort of if you become good at integrating relations, that becomes sort of a practice that you're, more skilled at. So anyway, yeah, I think so then you're sort of reducing that cognitive load. So that would be the way I think about it. I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, so Stella, Daniel, do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that considering multiple pathways is a good way forward? What are your thoughts?
I certainly think that there's definitely a multiple pathways, right? This is what I was trying to suggest, thinking about both Daniel's data and Lindsey's data, and as well as my own data. I think at any given, I think the question that's interesting is that if we ask about multiple pathways, it's like at any given moment, when you are thinking, at any given moment when you're thinking about relational similarity, when you're doing analogical reasoning at any given moment, what are the constituents that actually factor in order to be able to perceive that relational similarity? Right. So I think what's really interesting about culture and language and socialization factor that Lindsey had been talking about is that this becomes a very complex way of predicting about what might be actually happening at any given moment that you are about to enter a relational mindset, so to speak. And the kind of beginning work that I've started to see is that like relational is not all relational. So even though, to be honest, I myself have always claimed that attention to relation will make you to see relational similarity. And I think the multiple pathways in culture kind of make me, wait, hang on a moment. It doesn't always happen that way. There's still things that's happening underway, and figuring out that exactly, I think, will be very important for even for us who thinking about theory of analogical reasoning, like theory of relational thinking, about how does it actually unfold at any given moment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you all. Caren, I reflecting back on the narrowness of the region that you were where the union was in your diagram. I think that we're at a point in a bunch of these questions where we just don't know. All of us have been arguing on the basis of tasks that were designed for one purpose, and now we're repurposing them for something else. And all of our operationalizations are imperfect in some ways, and they might be even more imperfect as operationalizations of something new than they were for things that they were designed to test in the first place. So Stella, I was smiling and cheering when you were commenting on two different sets of tasks, the ambiguity of the triad tasks and how both arms of the triad are relational in different ways, and also the ambiguity in the Norenzayan flower task. Amrit and my other lab mates and I have discussed both of these points. And so until we've populated this space a little bit more, and until we've designed new perhaps until we've designed new tasks to ask precisely the questions that we're interested in now, we might not know what these measures mean, and some differences between experimental outcomes might be because we're using different tasks that were designed by different people for different purposes, and we're getting different answers because we're asking different questions, right, using different tools. One of the steps that we're taking to answer exactly the question that you have on the slide here, what is the relationship between holistic and analytic thinking versus analogical thinking, and in our case, event construal, is simply to see if they correlate with each other. So if you give within subjects, for example, the Nivan letter construal task on the one hand, and the BIF, this event, higher low level event construal task in the same subjects, does your tendency to see the forest for the trees perceptually predict your tendency to construe events at a higher level? And if there is such a correlation within subjects, what's the nature of that correlation? Is there a causal link? For example, if you can use the Nivan letters as a training task, you can instruct people instead of just letting them see the big letters or the little letters first. You can orient their attention toward either the global level or the local level perceptually. Does orienting people toward higher low-level perceptual construal cause them to construe things, these more abstract high-level cognitive tasks at a higher low level? These are studies that Amrit has in the pipeline, and so we can treat this as an empirical question and find out, given the tools that we have in our arsenal. I guess you don't have tools in an arsenal, in our box. Oh my gosh, Deidre's going to kill me. Given that we have these tools, we can find out whether things that we've observed previously in higher low level perception are correlated with or causal of ways of construing things cognitively at a higher low level.
Thanks. Yeah, actually, this conversation very clearly maps onto my second question. Here's my obligatory image, by the way. Alex and I were discussing the fact, as you know, that in some cross-cultural work, there isn't always this clear distinction between the tasks that are used and the various types of reasoning and constructs themselves. I forgot to introduce Alex Carstensen here also, and we prepared this discussion together. I'm sorry, Alex. I love you so. So the question for the panel here, right, is just, and maybe we've already kind of answered this in this discussion, and we can kind of move on here, is just like, what are these constructs? How many of them are there? How do they relate to each other? And it sounds like maybe we all agree that this is something that we still need some solid research on, unless anyone has anything to add to this. No, okay, we're all in agreement here. Okay, excellent. So, it's also possible, right, that the type of relation under consideration matters, right? We see, for example, no differences in the scene analogy task. Both cultural contexts seem to attend to objects primarily. We see this in Stella's work, we see it in Lindsey's work. On the other hand, right, we do see differences in the Ravens task, as Daniel has pointed out. We do see differences in the sort of quantitative relation task that Lindsey was pointing out, although even there too, right, kids seem to be sort of focusing on objects as well, but then also they sort of outperform in China compared to the US on this more relational aspect of the task. And in our own work, so in Alex and my work that somebody mentioned earlier, we do actually see when in an ambiguous task, in a causal reasoning task, where we're pitting relations against object properties, we see some really interesting differences in performance on this task as well. And so, the question is, first of all, what's going on with the scene analogy task? Is there something specific about that task? I would very much like to know. Or sort of more broadly, does the type of relationship that we're looking at matter here when we're considering these effects of culture? And if so, why, right? Why might we see these differences? So I open it up to anyone who's interested in answering.
If I may just jump in really quickly, I think one of the things that I should point out is that it's possible that indeed the type of relation matters. So I myself have conjecture, for example, social relations might actually be different in different, right? So there are actually new works where analogical reasoning in US adults using the usual like mapping task is actually analogical reasoning is actually better when it's construed as a social event. Some folks at Stanford recently did this. I forgot who are doing this. They're actually social psychologists. They're not analogists. So it's very interesting to see their work. But I also would like to point out another difference between the type of relations on the ones that we are discussing here right now. It is the presence and absence of object competitor. So in both Lindsey's and mine, using the scene analogy task, the Markman and Gantner scene analogy task, there's always object and relation. In the Ravens task, there's sort of kind of like an object match, but not really. I mean, it doesn't strongly come out as, that it will not leap to you mostly when you do like a Ravens task. And obviously in the quantitative relations there's not there's no direct competitions between the relation and object mass. So it may not be that, but it could also be that. So I just want to point out a possibility there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll just say, like, one of the slides that I skipped because I was taking too long was a description of the errors that children made when they were not picking the quantitative relation. What they were picking was very most often, when you had both the object color and shape changed. So these Chinese kids were noticing both relations. They were not just attending to just one or just the other, but most of the time, most of their answers on this task were attending to these sort of more object property based. These were relations, but they were more object property based relations. So I think this question is very interesting in terms of, and I think Stella is. I mean, I think I agree in that when there is object similarity, when there's object sort of information that's very salient, it becomes very hard to not attend to. And so if those are competitors, then you have to inhibit that attention. A lot of times, perceptual similarity sort of goes along with relational similarity in life. So, that's maybe an effective strategy to sort of look at these things together. And so again, whether that's something that is a system that we've developed from experience, or whether that's a system that is whether these are just two separate kinds of attention that happen to sometimes go together, I think is a really interesting question. But I do agree that when you don't have some kind of perceptual, information, it might become easier for everyone to attend to these abstract relations, sort of like when that's all that's there. And you saw that actually on our task, with Sean in that middle section. And now that I'm thinking about it, so you really see that difference, right? The kids were doing relational mapping when there was no other object, but then they went right back to it when that object match was there again. So, there was sort of this really strong draw toward that object similarity match.
I'm cognizant of time here, Sean. So should I have other questions, but it seems like it might be more fun to open it up. I mean, I can flash through them so you can think about it. So one thing I wanted to ask is what is it about socialization that leads to these differences? It seems like a massive question, right? That we have to unpack. What are the open questions, right? Where are you guys doing research now? I think it is a really interesting question that I'd like to know the answer to. And then what are some of the barriers of taking this approach? And I think instead of having you answer these right now, I think we should also allow some Q&A from the audience too. So I'll sort of end my leading of discussion here, but thanks guys for answering my questions.